More than 2,000 years have passed. But this night is one the entire world still remembers. A room in Jerusalem, a table, 13 men, bread, wine, and a conversation that changed the history of humanity forever. But here's a question almost nobody asks. Besides the bread and wine we know from Christian liturgy, what else was on that table? What smells filled that room? What flavors did Jesus and his 12 apostles share at their last meal together? For centuries, the Last Supper has been depicted in painting, sculpture, theater, and film. The most famous image in the world, Leonardo da Vinci's fresco, shows a table covered with bread, and practically nothing else that is historically accurate. What nobody tells you is this: that night was not an improvised or merely symbolic dinner. It was the Jewish Passover meal, the seder of Pesach. And that meal had a very specific menu, encoded over centuries in biblical and rabbinic tradition. Every dish had a name. Every food had a meaning. If you've never had this explained from this angle, subscribe now. The button is right below the video. To understand what was on the table, we first need to understand where they were and what night it was. It is the 14th of Nisan, in the year 30 AD. According to the dating most widely accepted by historians, in Jerusalem the city is literally overflowing. In normal times, Jerusalem had a population of between 40,000 and 80,000 inhabitants, but during Passover, the number skyrocketed enormously. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, mentions figures of up to 1 million pilgrims arriving in the city for the feast. The streets smell of roasted lamb, Oriental spices, freshly baked unleavened bread. Every household has been meticulously cleaned to eliminate any trace of chametz, leavened or fermented bread. It is a religious obligation taken with absolute seriousness. The Passover dinner, the seder, was not an ordinary meal. It was an edible liturgy. Every element had a specific Hebrew name. Every food recalled a specific moment in the Exodus narrative. The word seder means precisely that in Hebrew, call, order. It was encoded in a text called the Haggadah, which means narration. The Haggadah guided participants through 15 mandatory steps, from the opening prayers to the final songs, including the 4 cups of wine, the explanations of the symbolic foods, the eating of the Passover lamb, and the singing of the Hallel Psalms. Jesus and his apostles knew this order by heart. They had celebrated the Seder every year of their lives. Notice this detail. At the center of the table was an object called the ke'ara, the Seder plate. It was a large tray or plate containing the mandatory ritual foods. Each one was essential. Each one told part of the Exodus story. Let's examine them one by one, because Jesus saw them, touched them, and likely explained them to his disciples that night, just as the head of every Jewish household did throughout the world. The first is karpaz, a green vegetable, typically fresh parsley, celery, or in some traditions, tender leaf lettuce. This food is dipped in salt water before eating. The salt water represents the tears of the Israelite slaves in Egypt. The green vegetable represents hope and new life rising after weeping. It is the first food touched at the meal. The second ritual food is maror, the bitter herbs, typically finely grated horseradish, though bitter Roman lettuce or wild chicory were also used. Maror is eaten raw, in its most crude and penetrating state. Its flavor is intensely bitter, almost aggressive in the mouth and nose. The purpose is precise: to make whoever eats it feel the bitterness of slavery in Egypt, not as an abstract concept, but as a real, physical, uncomfortable experience. The third is charoset, a paste of dark brown texture and color, made from finely chopped or grated apples, crushed nuts, aromatic spices like cinnamon and clove, and red wine. Its appearance deliberately imitates the clay and mortar that Israelite slaves used to make bricks under the Egyptian sun. It's one of the most interesting foods of the Seder because it combines the appearance of suffering with a taste of sweetness and warmth. Rabbinic tradition explains this paradox. The sweetness of the charoset represents the hope that sustained the people in the midst of the most intense suffering. The fourth element is the zero-a a bone with some roasted meat, typically a lamb shank. It represents the Passover lamb whose blood the Israelites placed on the doorposts of their homes in Egypt. The fifth element is the bitzah, a hard-boiled egg, usually lightly singed over a flame. It represents the festival sacrifice offered at the temple. The absolute protagonist of the Passover table was the roasted lamb. It was not optional. It was not merely symbolic. It was the central dish of the meal, with precise biblical instructions going back to Exodus chapter 12. The rules for the Passover lamb were strict and admitted no improvisation. It had to be a male without any physical defect, less than 1 year old. It had to be slaughtered at twilight on the 14th of Nisan at the temple in Jerusalem. It had to be roasted whole over fire, without breaking any of its bones. A detail that New Testament writers considered prophetically significant when they described that Roman soldiers did not break Jesus' legs on the cross. And it had to be eaten completely that same night, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Alongside the lamb, the central bread of the table was matzah, unleavened bread. Matzah is a flat, hard bread of wheat flour and water, baked in under 18 minutes to prevent any fermentation process. Its texture is brittle and crunchy. When Jesus took the matzah that night and said, "This is my body," he was not using a random or improvised element. He was using precisely the bread his listeners had eaten at every Passover of their lives, the bread without blemish, the bread of freedom, the bread tradition associated with the complete absence of sin. Besides the lamb and the matzah, the Passover table included other foods typical of first-century Jewish cooking in Galilee and Judea. Hard-boiled eggs soaked in salt water were a regular part of the start of the meal. Dips and legume pastes were omnipresent on the ancient Middle Eastern table. Lentils cooked with virgin olive oil and aromatic herbs. Mashed fava beans with garlic and parsley. Chickpea paste seasoned with toasted cumin. Virgin olive oil from the olive groves on the Mount of Olives was the universal condiment of every meal in Palestine. Olives cured in salt and herbs. Fresh and dried dates from the Jordan Valley. Fresh figs from Galilean trees. Pomegranates split open with their ruby juice. Pistachios and almonds toasted with salt. All of these elements completed a table that was abundant, colorful, and aromatic, very different from the austere and nearly empty image that for centuries has represented the Last Supper in Western art. When the Gospels mention that Jesus took the cup after the meal and identified it as the new covenant in his blood, first-century readers would have immediately understood which cups they were referring to. Because at the Passover seder, there was not one cup. There were 4, and each had a specific name and a precise theological meaning. The wine drunk in first-century Palestine was red wine from the vineyards of Judea, dense, dark, sweet, and strong, very different from modern dry European wines. The 4 cups of the seder correspond to the 4 promises of liberation God makes in Exodus chapter 6. I will bring you out. I will free you. I will redeem you. I will take you as my people. The first cup, Kiddush, sanctification, is drunk at the start of the meal, with a blessing that sanctifies the feast. The second cup, the cup of the plagues, is drunk before the main meal, after narrating the 10 plagues of Egypt. During the narration of each plague, the finger is dipped in the wine, and a drop is let fall on the table, deliberately reducing one's own wine. The third cup, the cup of redemption, is drunk after the main meal with the prayer of thanksgiving called Birkat Hamazon. This is almost certainly the cup the evangelists identify when they write that Jesus took the cup after supper and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood which is poured out for you." The fourth cup, the cup of praise, is drunk at the end of the meal during the singing of the Hallel. The Last Supper was not a silent meal. It was a sung meal. The Hallel, from the same Hebrew root that gives us the word Hallelujah, is a collection of worship psalms sung during the Passover seder. At some point during the third part of the meal, after the lamb, after the third cup, at the heart of the seder, Jesus did something unexpected. He took the matzah, the flat and brittle unleavened bread, and pronounced the usual blessing any Jewish father pronounces over the bread at the seder. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." And then Jesus added something that was not in any Haggadah and not in any previous tradition. "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." Then he took the third cup, the cup of redemption, and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." When the disciples ask Jesus who will betray him, he answers that it is the one to whom he will give the dipped piece of bread. In the culture of the ancient Middle East, the host dipped the bread and gave it to the most honored guest at the table. Jesus gave the dipped bread to Judas Iscariot, a last gesture of love, a last exit door. Judas took it and went out immediately into the night. The Gospel of John records with a literary starkness that is not forgotten. It was night. Outside, it was night. Inside Judas it was too. When Jesus and the 11 remaining apostles left singing the Hallel toward the Mount of Olives, they left behind a table. On that table remained the bones of the Passover lamb, the remnants of the broken matzah, cups of red Judean wine, the half-finished charaset, the bitter maror, fresh parsley, and salt water, olives and dates, figs and almonds. An ordinary dinner, a dinner exactly like the 100s of Jewish families in Jerusalem were finishing at that very moment. We have walked today through a table that is more than 2,000 years old. We smelled the lamb roasted over live coals. We bit into the bitterness of the maror. We tasted the bittersweet mix of the charaset. We drank 4 cups of dark red Judean wine. We sang the Hallel under the spring stars of Jerusalem. What is extraordinary about that night is that it did not end. The gestures Jesus made over the bread and wine have been literally repeated billions of times across 20 centuries of human history. In Roman catacombs of the 2nd century, in medieval Gothic cathedrals, in mud churches in sub-Saharan Africa, in clandestine communities in 20th century China, the bread and wine of that night remain on the table. The most important meal in human history was at the same time a perfectly ordinary dinner of a 1,400-year-old tradition. That is exactly what makes it inexplicably extraordinary. Thanks for sitting at this table with us today. See you in the next one.